Imagine waking up one morning and your government tells you every single computer you use for work is getting wiped. Windows is gone, Microsoft is gone. Everything you've known for the last 2 decades replaced overnight. Now imagine that happening to 2.5 million people, all at once. That's not a sci-fi plot. That's exactly what France just ordered. And the reason why? They're done trusting American tech giants with their most sensitive government data. This is one of the boldest moves in the history of digital politics, and almost nobody in the United States is talking about it. So let's talk about it. To understand why France is doing this, you have to understand what the last 20 years of government tech actually looks like. Most Western governments, including the US, basically handed the keys of their digital infrastructure to a handful of American companies. Microsoft, Google, Amazon. And for a long time, that seemed fine. These companies were reliable, well-supported, and already dominant everywhere else. But here's the thing, nobody asked out loud, what happens when those companies change their pricing? What happens when they get hacked? What happens when a foreign government, your government, realizes it has zero control over the software running everything from social services to national defense? France started asking those questions seriously about 5 years ago. And in early 2026, they stopped just asking and started acting. Here's what happened. France's digital authority, called DINUM, the Interministerial Directorate of Digital Affairs, issued a directive that every ministry in the French government must stop using American software and migrate to open-source alternatives. That includes swapping out Windows for Linux, replacing Microsoft Teams with open-source communication tools, and fundamentally rebuilding how the French civil service runs its technology. The scale of this is almost hard to wrap your head around. We're talking about 2.5 million government workstations, every clerk, every regulator, every analyst, and every ministry all switching operating systems. And DINUM didn't just issue the order from a distance. On April 8th of 2026, they started the migration at their own headquarters first, converting 250 of their own workstations right away as a live proof of concept. They're putting skin in the game. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that should make every American paying attention sit up a little straighter. This isn't just about software preferences. This is about power, specifically about who controls the digital layer underneath a nation's government. When you run Windows, you are dependent on Microsoft for updates, for security patches, for licensing, for everything. And Microsoft is an American company, subject to American law, American court orders, and American intelligence requests. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's just the legal reality. France looked at that dependency and decided it was a national security risk they were no longer willing to accept. French officials have been explicit about it. They've used the phrase digital sovereignty over and over again. The idea is simple. If you don't control your software, you don't fully control your government. And the financial argument is just as strong as the security one. Analysts who've looked at this migration estimate the total cost somewhere between 1.5 billion and 3 billion euros over 5 to 7 years. That sounds like a lot, but consider what France has been paying Microsoft in licensing fees year after year for millions of machines, and suddenly that number looks a lot more like an investment than an expense. Open source software doesn't disappear behind a paywall. It doesn't get a surprise price hike. It doesn't hold your data hostage during a contract dispute. Once you build it, you own it. The full migration is targeted for completion by 2030, with pilot deployments across various ministries kicking off in the second half of 2026. And as of right now, mid-May, 2026 ministries across France are actively working on their individual migration strategies. This thing is already in motion. But let's be honest about the challenges here, because there are real ones. This is not a simple plug-and-play situation. Some government agencies run highly specialized software, think healthcare management systems, financial regulatory tools that are deeply embedded in the Windows ecosystem. Open-source alternatives for those specific tools either don't exist yet or aren't mature enough to replace them without serious development work. That means France isn't just swapping one operating system for another. They're also investing in building new software from scratch, or adapting existing tools, or negotiating with vendors to port their software to Linux. That takes time, money, and expertise, and there will almost certainly be disruptions along the way. There's also a training problem. 2.5 million civil servants have spent their careers on Windows. The interface is different on Linux. The applications are different. Even something as simple as the file manager looks and behaves differently. Rolling out that kind of change across an entire government workforce without tanking productivity is an enormous logistical challenge. And then there's this deeper, harder-to-solve issue. Even if France replaces the desktop software, the cloud infrastructure underneath most modern applications is still overwhelmingly American. Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud. Switching from Windows to Linux on the laptop doesn't change the fact that the server farms powering government applications may still be sitting in Virginia data centers subject to U.S. jurisdiction. France knows this. They're not pretending this migration solves everything, but they view it as a necessary first step and a powerful symbolic one. Here's the part of this story that really puts it into perspective for the rest of the world. France is not doing this alone. In November of 2025, France and Germany held a joint summit specifically on European digital sovereignty and created a task force to develop joint policy recommendations. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein has already completed nearly 80% of its migration of 30,000 workstations to open-source software and has recorded 15 million euros in licensing savings so far. And in June of 2026, France is scheduled to host what they're calling the Digital Industry Meetings, a formal summit expected to bring together multiple European governments, private sector players, and the open-source developer community. The goal is nothing less than a continental alliance around digital independence from American tech platforms. Think about what that means. The world's fourth and fifth largest economies are actively coordinating a strategic withdrawal from American software infrastructure. This isn't some fringe movement. It's a policy shift happening at the highest levels of some of the world's most sophisticated governments. And what does this mean for American companies? For Microsoft, the implications are significant. Europe represents one of its largest enterprise markets. If this migration succeeds in France and spreads, and there's real momentum suggesting it will, Microsoft could be looking at the loss of millions of government contracts across the continent. That's not an overnight collapse, but it's a meaningful long-term erosion of market share in a sector that has historically been considered bulletproof. Government contracts are stable, recurring, and enormous. Losing them doesn't just hurt the bottom line. It weakens the argument that Windows is the inevitable, universal choice for serious institutions. So what happens next? The honest answer is, it depends on execution. If France pulls this off, if the pilot deployments in late 2026 go smoothly, if the ministries build credible migration plans, if the 2030 deadline starts looking realistic, this becomes a global case study. Other countries, watching from the sidelines, will take notice. Not just in Europe, but in Asia, in Latin America, in the global South, where government tech spending is growing fast and where dependence on American platforms carries its own political complications. And here in the United States, this should spark a real conversation. We've largely taken for granted that our tech companies would always dominate global infrastructure. We assumed the rest of the world would just keep renewing their Windows licenses forever. France is betting that assumption is wrong, and they're betting 2.5 million government computers on it. Whether you see this as a smart move toward national independence or an overly ambitious government overreach, you have to admit one thing. The world's relationship with American tech is changing. The era of unchallenged dominance may be entering a new, more contested phase, and France just fired what might be the opening shot. If you found this interesting, make sure to subscribe. We cover the stories at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and power that most channels don't touch. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this migration will actually succeed? Or is this too ambitious to pull off by 2030? I want to know what you think.